The clock strikes midnight, and with it, a new year begins. But what if the start of that new year isn't the fresh beginning we all expect? What if, just as the ball drops, something darker, something far more sinister, slips in through the cracks unnoticed? Imagine the sound of laughter fading into the background as you hear a faint knock on the door, a shadow that wasn't there a second ago, or a cold breath on the back of your neck even though no one's behind you. There are stories, unsettling ones, that tell of strange, ghostly encounters that occur on New Year's Eve, when the veil between worlds seems thinner than ever. Tonight, we dive into the chilling, eerie side of New Year's Eve. Stay with us as we share true stories of inexplicable events, disturbing encounters, and terrifying mysteries that unfolded at the stroke of midnight. You might want to check the locks on your doors before continuing, because you never know who or what might be knocking. But before we get lost in the shadows, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out our chilling upcoming episodes. If you're enjoying our eerie stories, leave a like, drop a comment, and share the terror with others. And for even more eerie content, follow us on social media. Keep the fear alive. Thanks for joining me on this spooky journey. Now, let's dive into the nightmare. It was New Year's Eve 2022, and after a long year of disappointment and uncertainty, I was craving some fun. My friend Jess had invited me to a New Year's Eve party at a nightclub in a tall building downtown. I was hesitant, but when she mentioned it was supposed to be an exclusive event on the 13th floor, I couldn't resist. The invitation had a fancy design with black and gold detailing, and the promise of an unforgettable night was too tempting to pass up. I arrived at the building just before midnight. The lobby was bustling with people in evening gowns and tuxedos, all of them eager for the night ahead. A wave of excitement rushed through me. It had been so long since I'd gotten dressed up and gone out. The elevators were already crowded, and I noticed the familiar unease of the number 13 on the elevator panel as I hit the button. I had to remind myself that this was just superstition. When the elevator doors opened on the 13th floor, I immediately noticed the strange atmosphere. The hallway was unusually quiet for a party, and the lighting was dim, with only a few soft, flickering overhead bulbs. The floor was bare, with no signs of the extravagant party I had imagined. I could hear the muffled sound of music, but it didn't seem to be coming from any nearby rooms. No one greeted me as I stepped off the elevator, and a sudden wave of unease washed over me. Jess wasn't anywhere in sight. I walked further down the hallway, trying to find something that looked like a party. Most of the doors were closed, but I could hear soft murmurs from inside a room at the end of the hall. Curiosity led me to knock, but before I could even pull my hand away, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, a group of people stood in a perfect circle, all staring at the floor. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes dark and vacant. They wore formal attire, but their clothing seemed out of place, too old-fashioned, like something from a different time. One person, a tall man with pale skin, slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were hollow, deep wells of emptiness. His lips parted, but no words came out. I stood frozen, staring back at him, when one of the others, a woman with dark hair, suddenly whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." A chill ran down my spine. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted back down the hallway, but it felt like the walls were closing in. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever. No matter how fast I ran, the elevator doors refused to open, and I was stuck in a maddening loop, hearing the footsteps of others growing louder behind me. I turned into another hallway, desperate for an exit, but I only found more doors that opened into empty rooms. The sounds of murmurs grew more intense, more suffocating. Finally, I found an emergency stairwell. I raced down the steps, feeling like something was right behind me. But when I burst through the door and into the street, the night air hit me like a slap in the face. I couldn't stop shaking. The panic that had overwhelmed me was now slowly giving way to confusion. I tried to call Jess, but my phone had no signal. I had no idea what just happened. I didn't tell anyone about the experience at first. But when I finally checked the building's directory online the next day, I couldn't find any mention of a 13th floor. I did some research and found that the building had skipped the 13th floor altogether, like so many other buildings do due to superstition. I can't explain what happened that night, and I don't think I ever want to. To this day, I avoid that part of town altogether, and every New Year's Eve I find myself remembering those hollow eyes and the strange, quiet circle of people that seemed to be waiting for me. I live in a small rural town deep in the mountains where the nearest neighbors are miles away. Every year, my friends and I would travel to my family's cabin for a quiet New Year's retreat. This particular year, the weather had been brutal. A blizzard had rolled in the night before and we almost cancelled our trip. But we pushed through, managing to drive up the snowy mountain roads and reach the cabin by mid-afternoon. By the time nightfall arrived, the snow was coming down even heavier. The wind howled outside and the snow had already piled up a foot deep. But we were cozy inside the cabin, sipping whiskey by the fire and making plans for the evening. As midnight approached, we decided to go outside and celebrate with a bonfire. The sky was clear, though the cold was biting, and the snow had created a blanket of silence over everything. We bundled up in jackets and hats, and as the fire crackled to life, we stared out into the vast expanse of white. That's when we noticed them. Standing at the edge of the tree line, just past the fire's glow, were 3 figures. They were far enough away that we couldn't make out their faces, but we could see their dark silhouettes against the snow. It was hard to tell if they were standing still or moving, but the longer we stared, the more unnatural their presence became. I brushed it off at first, assuming they were other hikers or maybe hunters, though we hadn't seen anyone else on the mountain. But there was something strange about the way they stood, motionless, just watching us. After a minute, Steve, who always liked to push boundaries, decided to shout, "Hey, you guys lost or something?" There was no answer, no movement. I could feel my heart start to race as I turned to my friends, but they seemed just as confused as I was. Then the wind shifted, and the figures finally began to move, but it wasn't normal. It wasn't the way a person walks. They shuffled slowly, unnaturally, like they were dragging their feet through the snow. They didn't pick up their legs, just dragging them across the ground. "Steve, we need to get inside," I whispered, but he ignored me, still watching the figures approach. The moment they took a step closer, a wave of fear washed over me. These figures weren't right. They didn't seem human. Their shapes were wrong, their movements erratic. It wasn't just that they weren't wearing proper snow gear, they were dressed in old, tattered clothing, almost like something from the 1800s. And their faces, I couldn't see them clearly, but the little I could make out made my stomach twist with dread. They were pale, almost ghostly, and their eyes were hollow and empty, like they were staring at nothing. As they came closer, my breath caught in my throat. I felt paralyzed with fear. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my chest. One of them, who looked like a woman, raised her hand slowly, almost mechanically, as if trying to wave or beckon us closer, but then she stopped and simply pointed at me, her fingers stiff and jerky. Her mouth didn't move, but I could feel her gaze burning into me. Without a word, we ran inside, slamming the door behind us. We all stood in the living room, our hearts racing, not knowing what to do. The wind outside had picked up, and the snow battered the windows. But worst of all, the eerie feeling that something was watching us didn't go away. We didn't speak much after that. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. We were all on edge. The fire crackled and popped in the corner, but the silence between us was thick. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed up, listening for any sounds outside, but nothing happened. By morning, the snow had stopped falling, and the sun shone through the trees. We cautiously stepped outside, looking around, but there was no sign of anyone. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed, as though the figures had never been there. But I know what we saw. We all know. And now, every New Year's Eve, I can't help but think of those pale, lifeless figures standing in the snow, waiting for us to notice them. It was New Year's Eve 2019, and I had planned to spend it alone. My boyfriend had been traveling for work, and we'd agreed to celebrate when he returned. So instead of attending a party or heading out for the night, I decided to enjoy a quiet evening at home. The house was cozy, filled with the smell of freshly baked cookies I had made earlier, and the TV was playing reruns of shows I'd watched 100 times before. It was comforting, almost like a tradition. As midnight drew closer, I glanced at the clock, 11:59 p.m., and I reached for my phone. I sent a couple of Happy New Year messages to friends and family, though I wasn't expecting anyone to come over. It felt nice, in a way, to embrace the peacefulness of the night. No chaos, no party, just me and my thoughts as the year turned over. The countdown on the TV started. 10, 9, 8. I smiled to myself, watching the screen as the excitement of the moment began to build. But then, just as the clock hit 12 o'clock, something unexpected happened. A loud, sharp knock echoed from the front door. I froze. Who could it be? No one had mentioned visiting, and I hadn't seen a car pull up in the driveway. My first instinct was to ignore it, probably just someone out on a walk or a prank, but curiosity got the best of me. I walked over to the door, peeking through the peephole, but I saw nothing. The porch light illuminated the front step, but there was no sign of anyone. I shook my head, thinking it was probably just my imagination. I closed the door, but just as I did, I turned back to the TV, only to see the countdown start over. It was midnight again, 12 o'clock. I blinked and checked my phone. It was still the same. 12 a.m. What the hell, did I just misread the time? Was there some sort of glitch in the TV broadcast? Confused, but not immediately concerned, I settled back into the couch. But just as I began to settle in, I heard it again, the knock at the door. This time, it was louder, more urgent. I stood frozen, staring at the door for a moment before I reluctantly walked over and opened it. But once again, there was no one there. Just the same empty street, lit by the faint glow of the porch light. A strange, cold breeze swept past me, causing a shiver to run down my spine. I closed the door again, and as I turned back toward the living room, my eyes instinctively drifted to the TV. The countdown was happening again. I was starting to feel dizzy, like something was wrong, something I couldn't quite grasp. My hand trembled as I reached for the remote, muting the TV for a moment. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 12 o'clock. How? I was sure I had already watched the ball drop. I had heard the cheers from the TV, felt the usual moment of excitement as the year officially changed, but now it seemed like everything had reset. I checked my phone again. Same time, 12 a.m. I walked back to the door, feeling a sense of unease creeping up my spine. I opened it, but once again there was no one there, not a single soul in sight. I stared into the night, trying to make sense of what was happening, when I heard something else, soft, distant footsteps. I jerked my head in the direction of the sound. My eyes scanned the dark, but nothing was there. The silence felt oppressive, and then for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a shadow dart across the street just outside the glow of the porch light. I stepped outside onto the porch, my heart racing. The cold air hit my face and I looked down at the snow-covered yard, my breath misting in front of me. But there was nothing. The street was still and quiet, like it had been before. A heavy silence settled in the air. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I realized something even stranger. The countdown on the TV had started again. And this time, I could hear it in my head too, like an echo, as if it was playing inside my mind. 10, 9, 8. The clock on the wall still said 12 o'clock. I couldn't explain it. I felt like I was stuck in some kind of loop. I turned the TV off and grabbed my phone, but even though it was still showing the correct time, the second the countdown hit midnight again, I could hear the knock on the door once more. My stomach twisted. What was happening? Was this a glitch? A strange dream? I tried to leave the house, but my feet felt heavy, like I was moving through thick, sticky air. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, but this time the snow didn't feel cold. It felt wrong. As though the ground beneath me had turned to something softer, like sand, even though I could see the snow clearly in the yard. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Every time I tried to move, the world around me flickered like a broken film reel. The knocking didn't stop. Each time I turned back to the house, I could hear it, louder and louder, until it drowned out everything else. Knock, knock, knock. It was a steady, rhythmic sound that filled my head. And then, like a cruel joke, the countdown continued. Every time it struck midnight, I was transported back to the front door, like it was some kind of twisted time loop, and every time the knocking would come. I don't know how long it lasted, an hour, maybe more, or maybe I lost track of time altogether. But at some point, everything just stopped. I woke up the next morning, lying on the couch. The sun was shining through the window. My phone was beside me, still showing January 1st, like nothing had happened. But I knew something had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something crucial, something beyond my understanding. The knocking, the countdown, it was all real. It had felt so real. And the worst part? Every New Year's Eve since then I've waited for the knock. Waited for the countdown to start again. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, but the memories are too vivid, too real. I can still hear the knock echoing in my mind, always at midnight. I don't open the door anymore. And every year I find myself checking the time and watching the countdown with a growing sense of dread, wondering if the loop will start again, wondering if it will ever end. It was my first year living alone in the city, and I was determined to make it a memorable New Year's Eve. After a chaotic holiday season, I craved some solitude, but not in the usual sense. I invited a small group of friends over to my new apartment. No big party, just a few of us, gathered to celebrate the end of a particularly difficult year. The place wasn't huge, but it was cozy enough, with large windows that overlooked the city lights in the distance. The night had a peaceful feel to it until midnight rolled around. I'd only been in the apartment for a few months, but I'd never really felt alone. Something about the place felt off. I couldn't pinpoint it. Maybe it was the creaky floors, the odd buzzing noise coming from the walls, or the strange feeling that there were times when the temperature would drop for no reason at all. But I wasn't the type to overthink things. I was starting fresh, and I figured I could deal with some minor quirks. The night was everything I wanted it to be. Friends filled the room with laughter and clinking glasses as we chatted about the highs and lows of the year. As midnight approached, I cracked open a bottle of champagne and poured it into glasses, arranging them on the kitchen counter. I felt a sense of excitement bubble inside me, the kind of excitement that comes with possibility, the feeling that a new year could bring new hope. The countdown began. Everyone gathered around the TV, half drunk and in good spirits, raising their glasses. 10, 9, 8. The room grew louder with each second, anticipation mounting. At that moment, I felt something stir in the back of my mind, something that I couldn't quite place. But then the clock hit midnight. "Happy New Year," we all yelled, and the celebration ensued. I took a deep breath and brought my glass of champagne to my lips, ready to take a celebratory sip. But that's when things got strange. There was a knock. It was soft at first, quiet, almost like a tapping at the door. I paused, the glass halfway to my mouth, staring at the door. Everyone else was still talking, too caught up in their own excitement to notice. The knocking came again, but this time it was louder, more insistent, as if someone was pressing against the door, trying to get my attention. I hesitated. The knocking didn't make sense. None of my friends were near the door, and no one had been expected to arrive. Who could it be at this hour? My pulse quickened. I glanced around the room. Everyone was distracted, too caught up in the moment to notice the noise. I set my glass down on the counter and walked toward the door. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the handle. The knocking had stopped the second I'd moved, leaving only the soft hum of the TV and the sound of muffled voices from the other room. I opened the door cautiously. No one was standing on the other side, just the empty hallway outside. But I noticed something odd. A single champagne flute resting on the floor by the entrance. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up, my fingers brushing the glass, feeling an unsettling coldness. It was perfectly clean, like it had just been placed there, waiting. I turned it over in my hands, looking for any sign of what could have happened, but it was pristine. No dust, no fingerprints, nothing to indicate how it had gotten there. I set the glass back on the counter and tried to shake off the weird sensation. The knocking, the glass, it was just a fluke, right? But as I turned back to the group, I felt it, a presence behind me. I looked over my shoulder, but no one was standing there. My friends were still deep in conversation, unaware of the odd occurrence. I shook my head, trying to push the unsettling feeling aside. It was just the weirdness of being in a new apartment, I told myself. But then something even stranger happened. The glass that had been left on the counter, the one I had set down after picking it up, moved. Not with a gentle slide or a nudge, no. It was more like it had been pushed by an unseen force. It slid across the countertop slowly, as if guided by an invisible hand. My breath caught in my throat, and my legs went rigid. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, standing closest to the counter, turned around, and we locked eyes. The others followed her gaze to the glass. The room fell silent. "What the hell?" Sarah muttered, and the room's light-hearted atmosphere shifted into something darker. Before anyone could say anything else, the glass moved again, but this time it tipped slightly. Champagne began pouring itself into the glass, as if some unseen person were holding the bottle, carefully filling it up without even touching it. The liquid swirled inside the glass, just like a normal pour. But I couldn't stop staring. I felt my heart racing in my chest, and the temperature in the room dropped. The knocking came again, louder this time, and I could swear I heard a faint voice calling out, something low, almost a whisper, but not from anyone in the room. It came from the kitchen, from the direction of the counter. I leaned in to hear it better, but I couldn't make out the words. It was as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. Suddenly the voice became clearer and I caught the chilling words. "Drink it." The words sent a chill down my spine. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, and I felt the weight of the situation press down on me. It was as if the air itself had thickened, the room closing in around me. Before I could respond, the glass moved again, this time flying off the counter, shattering against the floor with a loud crash. The champagne splattered across the kitchen, but no one had touched it. The whole room froze. I don't know what happened after that. I remember scrambling to grab my jacket, the panic setting in as my friend started backing toward the door. I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The air felt wrong, suffocating. We left in a hurry, not saying much to each other. No one wanted to be the first to acknowledge what had just happened. But the feeling of being watched, of something unseen moving through the room, stayed with me long after the night was over. In the days that followed, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, maybe someone played a prank. But when I returned to the apartment, the shattered glass was gone. No traces of it remained. The kitchen was spotless. Everything was as it had been before. Except for one thing. On the kitchen counter, where the glass had once sat, there was a single, faint print, a fingerprint. It was small, barely visible, as though someone had placed their finger on the surface of the counter. But I was alone when I returned. I don't know what happened that night, I can't explain it. But I haven't been able to shake the feeling that whatever was there, it wanted me to drink from that glass. And every New Year's Eve since then, I can't help but wonder if it will happen again, if the knocking will come, and if I'll ever understand what it really wanted from me. Have you ever faced something truly terrifying? Eerie Shadows wants to hear your story. Share your chilling experiences with us on Reddit, and together we'll uncover the eerie mysteries lurking in the shadows. If you'd like to support the channel and help us create even more terrifying content, consider checking out our Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support helps us keep the horror alive. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more bone-chilling tales like this one. Stay tuned for the next eerie episode